So very good to have you here, Johanna. Just a brief introduction for our audience. You're a curator of 20th century furniture and product design at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And you are also the founder and the director of the design magazine Disegno, which many of our visitors certainly know. And I wanted to speak with you, obviously, because you're a great expert on design, on contemporary design, on many different issues. And you also wrote an amazing and long review on our Atlas of Furniture Design, which is one topic I would love to address, but also go through with you through some of the topics that really us as design curators should address in our museums. And I think you being linked to the Victoria and Albert Museum is a very interesting situation, because the V&A Museum obviously is the largest design museum in the world. And our institution is a rather focused one. So I think it's also interesting to have this exchange among different institutional perspectives. Well, let's start with the Atlas. I have the book here with me. You know,
I can see it, yeah.
You know it.
Yeah.
I guess our visitors already have seen it before. Well, you had a close look at the whole book, and as an expert in furniture design, I suppose you found a lot of things that you already knew in the book. I hope there were also some discoveries. And well, in your review, you mentioned that, of course, there's some entries which are rather classical, like text about objects, but then there's also elements like information graphics, for example, or glossaries about materials that are used. So what were aspects of the book that you think are especially helpful when studying furniture design as a curator or as a student? Could you say something about that?
Well, I think, as I wrote in my review, which I guess we should say as a shameless plug, was published in Disegno, the quarterly journal of design, and you can find it online if you wish to read it. I reflected there that it's a really welcome rigor in terms of approaching a view on furniture design. And I think because nowadays furniture design often can be confused with pure surface, with kind of beautiful glossy shoots in interior design magazines. It's sometimes maybe not given that rigor and approach of more historical and analytical thinking. And I think that what you've done with the Atlas of Furniture Design is to give the field of furniture design another importance for a more general audience, because I think that if you work within the field we work in, of course you have an interest in it, but and can make those connections of the social, political, economic implications of furniture materials, furniture manufacturing techniques. But I think for a broader general audience, I don't necessarily think that that's as obvious. And I think that that's what the Atlas of Furniture Design really brings to the fore, and therefore is a welcome tool in the plethora of many books on design out there.
Well, you said that when speaking about furniture, it's often about the surface. It's a very, you could say, superficial study topic. Why is that so? What do you think? Because we know that it's a cultural thing. It's an object that really implies a lot of cultural symbolism and meaning, and also design knowledge. So why has that always been a rather, let's say, trendy topic? But there's few literature available. I mean, that was also for us one reason to do that book, because we often discovered that when looking for really reliable sources on furniture design, there's a lot of books with nice pictures, short texts, but it's always the same information, and often that information is copied, and sometimes it's wrong. So wrong information is multiplied. Why do you think is that the case in furniture design?
Well, I think, you know, if we take a step back and look at the area of publishing, I think that often the way that that field works is that you go for topics that you think will sell well. And I think that at times the briefer, the broader an overview, the better, because it reaches a wider audience. And I think that therefore at times there isn't as much risk taking within the publishing around design as maybe it should be. And not just design publishing, but publishing in general at times when it comes to topics of lifestyle. And I think that furniture therefore often is superseded by the kind of lifestyle argument. It is about how people want to decorate their homes, or having a more useful tool for how to do that or help them do that, which is of course also very welcome. And I think that DIY literature in that sense has a great history in the 20th century. But I think looking at furniture in a more academic fashion is one that maybe is seen to not appeal as much. But I think that what you can prove with the kind of risk that you've taken in putting together such a substantial book on the topic and working for so many years as you did on making that happen, I think can also push in another direction to make it more appealing for these sort of publications to be out there. And again, of course, I'm talking about this in regards to a much more general audience rather than an expert audience. And I think that that's where we can see things changing. And of course, furniture as a subject matter in general, I think even this year, I think has had a completely different interest to people, because we think about it so much more, because we are situated in circumstances in which we are forced to consider how we work, how we live, who we live with, and what the comfort or discomfort furniture can bring to our lives. I think that in some ways the atlas at this particular time is very timely.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because yes, this year is a year where I think we all spend more time at home than ever. So I'm wondering what will be a piece of furniture in 50 years when we look back that represents our time. You know, when we look back at furniture history, I think there's some pieces that we all think about when we think about certain times. You know, the cantilever chair, 1920s, this representation of lightness and functionalism. And what do you think? What would be a piece of furniture that represents this strange year 2020?
Maybe a bed. I think that people, including myself, have found great comfort in bedding down and just sort of escaping the world, but also having it as a very useful platform from which we can work, entertain, be entertained. What do you think? What do you think you would pick from this moment?
Well, I'm not so much a bed worker, I have to say. I think, well, for me it was pretty much the working desk, you know, a small desk, not like in the office, but just the desk where you have all your stuff and you have your laptop. And I was interviewed quite often this year what I think about the home office and so on. And then I always mentioned the piece of the paravent, you know. Mm-hmm. This flexible, foldable screen, which I think could very well have a second life now, when dividing homes in a very flexible manner. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, indeed, they are. I just spoke to someone about it yesterday, that paravents or room dividers or screens are very attractive objects to exhibit, because they are like beautiful surfaces that often have a piece of decoration or a way of resolving a kind of structural a query or problem and present it to best effect. But within our homes, it depends on how big your home is, I think. Because I guess the other reality of this year is that spending so much time in our homes, I think it also gives people little escape from their day-to-day. And you know, a home for everyone isn't the sanctuary that maybe we want or hope for it to be. And I think that's another reality that as design commentators, if we kind of can fit within that broader field, is something we need to consider, because I think at times a home equals something that is a kind of haven or an escape. But of course, for a lot of people, I'm thinking about a lot of school children who have not been able to go to school, for example, this year. You know, home is maybe not a place where they feel always at ease to learn and to take in what they do within a school environment, for example. And I think that many of us, especially in London where I live, share homes with people that are not part of our family, but with friends, and not even friends, but people who you do not know so well. So homes are not always what we in our minds or in our dreams want it to be. And I think that's a realization of this year that we have to maybe be more acknowledging of also.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, we have an exhibition at the moment in our museum called Home Stories, which we opened very briefly before the lockdown in February. And you had come to see it. So now we extended it. Now it's closed again since early November. So somehow this exhibition gets a completely different meaning in this year, Home Stories. We all had our home stories in 2020. And what we discovered when preparing that exhibition was that, like with furniture, there is very little discourse about the home, you know, the cultural significance about the home. It's pretty much about, you know, how to decorate it nicely, what are the right colors to choose, and the materials and the styles. But really looking at the cultural history of the home and what it means politically, socially, and how it reflects identities is hard to find about the interior. Do you think that this year will change that we realize more and more, and also among a wider audience, how important the home is, and that it's a place to be studied sociologically in order to understand what happens there?
I totally think so. I mean, I think that it's a field of study in many different areas: anthropology, psychology, geography, finances, economy. But I think that we certainly have a completely different perspective on home from this year. And I think that as a result, because we often reflect on what we surround ourselves with, I do think that we can probably see an increase in writing about studies on these situations. But I think also what you maybe find in general, and again, I speak from a context of living in the UK, you know, I think that there is also a very big question about are there homes for all? Are there affordable homes for all? And I think that socio-political economic discussion is one that is currently being brought to the fore in most news media on a daily basis, because I think that what this moment has revealed is that we are not providing for everyone, and I say we, society, are not providing for everyone as much or as well as we should be.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you're right to point out that, of course, discussing about the home needs that you have a home. Otherwise, it's a luxury discussion. And the main discussion is, of course, how can we make homes affordable and disposable to all. And I mean, what happened this year, or there has been a lot of talking about the fact that the inner cities get less dense and less overcrowded with the pandemic, because a lot of people moved to the countryside. Again, I would say this is more a luxury possibility if you have the possibility to go to the countryside. On the other hand, it may well be that the demand for inner city dwelling space is getting a little lower, and prices may get down a little bit. I think that's something I read about London, at least, where the prices were extremely high. Do you think that's a short-lived phenomenon, or do you think that could lead to a different situation in cities where urban living space is more affordable on a longer term basis?
I mean, I do not think that I have the expertise to comment on that, but I can say, and this has been really quite fascinating at the same time as scary, during the lockdown, it's the first time that I've experienced the center of London empty. And it's been a real eye-opener to see a place that I have lived in for over 20 years, I think now, not inhabited in terms of people walking down the streets, using the roads, using the public transport systems. And it's a real kind of wake-up call in regards to the much bigger effects that the lockdown and the pandemic has had on our society. And I think that in kind of contrast with that, I live somewhere which is not in the center of town, which isn't quite the suburbs either, but is at the outskirts of the center. And it's quite a thriving space. The parks are used more than ever. The streets are highly populated. And I guess that brings us to also question, what are the city centers for and who do they serve? And I think that that's an aspect of this year that really has come to the fore. And I think that the outcomes and the consequences of that, I think, will be interesting to analyze. And because I haven't traveled, I cannot comment on what that experience is like in other cities. But in London, it's been really quite an eye-opening experience.
Yeah. Interesting. Johanna, let's go back a little bit to the atlas,
yes.
Because you also wrote about the fact that such a book, even as complete or comprehensive it may appear, will always cover only the tip of the iceberg. Of course, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of new pieces of furniture launched every year. So of course, the role of museums is to select, to make judgments, what is relevant, what could be interesting from a future perspective, looking back at our times, what not. And that brings me to the role of collections of museums, that have a role to preserve things, to preserve cultural heritage, which is also the design heritage. And obviously every attempt to look at design history is always shaped by the perspective of a museum's collection. So our Vitra Design Museum's collection has a certain profile, a certain history, which shapes what is in the collection, what are criteria that we're especially interested in. I think in our case, it's criteria that are linked to education on one hand, on the other hand, also on ideas like a certain progress or evolution in furniture design. I wrote about that in my introductory essay for the book. And looking at the V&A's collection, it's the oldest design collection in the world. It emerged in the mid-19th century. And it has a very different profile than our relatively young collection. My question is, do you think an atlas of furniture design would look completely different if based on the V&A's collection, or would you think there are some overlaps and some differences, and why?
Interesting. Well, to answer the first question, yes, entirely. I think that, of course it would, because I think the Vitra collection, as you said, is a young collection and one that's had a very, very distinct focus from the start. I think that the nature of how the V&A collection came together and how it's grown over the last over 150 years is one that would require a completely different response to if you did something like the Atlas of Furniture Design. I think what I said in my review on the Atlas is with such a title and such a scope, I think comes an immense responsibility as well. And I think that in our field, and I mean both here the contemporary design industry field and the field of design curation, I think that there needs to be clear for us that we need to understand our clear in kind of perpetuating a status quo. And as you said before, that you repeat mistakes of the past. And we need to become better at looking beyond the usual suspects. So I think that within the V&A collection, which of course spans a broader geography than the Vitra Design Museum, but also a broader time frame in terms of historical range, of course, it would be very different. But I think the reasons for doing such an atlas would also be very different. So I think that that's inevitable in a way. But I think that we, as both institutions, and I think that that's something that I think goes as a kind of reminder to the two of us as curators and people who contribute to this field, that I think that the lack of certain individuals within our histories is extremely prevalent within the design field. So I think that I commented on the lack of female designers, for example, and the lack of people of different ethnicities. And I think the same goes for the V&A collection. So I think that even though it's a broader span and time frame and geographies, those same issues still exist within a collection such as the V&As. And is the case in a lot of institutions collecting designs. I think that we need to be better at looking beyond what we already know and finding those new histories and new narratives that have remained untold to date. And I think that we need to engage in a completely different way with our contemporary context in order to not make the same mistakes for the future. So well, that's maybe, yeah, sorry.
Well, I agree that the known, the canon, you know, what is established as a baseline of design history, I would say it's probably pretty much the same, you know, the designs that everyone knows, and a few others which are not that known, but which fit pretty much in that canon because they are, you know, probably created by Western designers, rather male designers linked to industry, to all these established definitions of design. And you're right to mention that our contemporary perspective is always changing the way how we look at history and what we think is the relevant history that needs to be told. And I think we've had a very strong shift over the last 10 to 20 years, right? In what we think is the history of design and what has been considered as the periphery and has not been in the center of the attention, and what now we think should have a much more central role. So you mentioned the role of women, which are underrepresented in our museum's collection, and I suppose in the V&As as well. Are there
at least named women?
Sorry?
At least named women.
Yeah. Well, how are you dealing with that at the V&A? I mean, are there initiatives? Are there collection strategies where you try to set a special focus on new acquisitions? What is the way to tackle that?
I mean, as you mentioned previously, the V&A is a vast and old museum, and we have many different collecting departments within the museum. I belong to a department that collects modern and contemporary design and furniture, and in fact 2 departments, the furniture, textiles and fashion department and the design, architecture, digital department. Each department has its own collection strategy for how to look at our collections going forward. And of course, those very issues that you brought up there are things that are very much at the top of our agenda when we consider how and what we will collect going forward. So I think it's a way of saying, or even looking at, what do we have in our collection and how do we want to fill the gaps? What are the gaps that we want to fill? But also going forward, what are the stories that we want to be able to tell? It's quite interesting to see what you potentially find that you're missing when you're trying to tell a history of the past. So it's thinking about, how could I avoid a curator in the future saying the same about the collecting initiatives of this moment. Of course, that's impossible to foresee and to make perfect, and I don't think that in any that word can even feature in what we do. But I think that there's at least strong attempts at through our collection strategy address a more diverse range of makers, whether that's gender or race, sexuality.
And is there a kind of committee or people who are especially investigating that? How does that work practically? I'm asking because we're confronted with the same situation. Of course, we're much smaller, so probably the collecting much more direct. How does it work at the V&A?
Well, without like boring the audience with the kind of procedures that exist within an institution like the V&A, but in short terms, each department sets its collection strategy for the next 5 years, and that's an official document, as we are overseen by the Department of Media, Sports and Culture. We then send that to our head of collections that signs it off. And then that exists, and in fact it's something that you can download and look at the V&A website. I can share it with you, Matteo, if you want to see it. But it's shared openly, so it's a document that exists that our audience, if they wish, can actually access and see. And there they can see what each department has as a collection objective for the next 5 years. So that's how we do it. There isn't a committee as such that looks at these things, but there is a group of people that come together to look at future acquisitions in terms of both the budgets that they require, but also the stories that they tell. And of course, those questions can be asked in those forums. How does it respond to the collection strategy, and how does it deliver on the ambitions that we have as a museum as a whole?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's not boring at all. I suppose also not for the audience, because I think that's how museums take shape, and how acquisitions are decided. And I think it's important for people to know what happens behind the scenes when.
Of course.
How do things enter museums? Because they are seen as very important pieces when they are in the museum. But who makes the decisions? What are they representing?
And that's a very important question, Matteo. And I think it's one that, in fact, everyone could do better at being more transparent with. I think that there's not a wish not to be transparent, but as you say, that potentially we think that it's not something that our audiences necessarily want to hear too much about until maybe there is a problem or an issue or a question around it. But I agree that certainly being transparent about the who and the what and the when is interesting and very vital. In fact, we're working on a new permanent gallery for the museum on the 20th century and 21st century collections. And there we are actually also doing a very active call out for our visitors and the people that participate in making the museum what it is. For them to contribute ideas for how and what to collect, because I think that's always of interest to us, and those conversations on a broader and wider scale are very welcome, for sure.
Yeah, and I think these collections always represent what we are researching at the moment in museums, right? So
yes.
Topics that we think are relevant. And so you mentioned the topic of gender equality, diversity, which are things that enter the considerations of museum people. And another topic which is very important for us, and I know also for you, is of course topics of sustainability, issues like which materials are used in design and what impact do they have on ecosystems. And there we can mention that we will have a collaboration on an exhibition about plastics, where we discovered that we're both working on exhibitions about that topic, and we decided to to join forces and create an exhibition about the cultural history of plastics, but also the ecological consequences that we see today and possible futures. Could you say something about that project from your perspective? Why do you think that is relevant in a design museum at this point of time?
Yes, sure. I mean, first of all, yes, it's a collaborative project. It's very exciting that it's such a broad and collaborative project between V&A Dundee and Vitra Design Museum. So it's curators from across those three institutions that are coming together to look at the topic of plastics. If we situate it within the context of the V&A particularly, it's interesting because as a collection, we have very early examples of plastic. I mean, we have pre-plastic objects as well in the collection, but we have examples of the very first mid-19th century semi-synthetic plastics, and of course examples leading all the way up until today, with, for example, a pair of trainers by Adidas and Parley by the Oceans, designed by Alexander Taylor, which is made from illegal fishing nets. So as a collection, it's a broad span, even if it's in no way a complete collection of the history or development of plastic as a material. We nevertheless have that represented in the museum, and within those collections, you can see the important role that plastics fulfilled very early on, which was as a replacement for natural materials, depleting natural resources, but also a horrific abuse of other countries' natural resources through the kind of imperialist system of the West over other countries, whereby the plastics represented another way of making and another way of creating a lure around the material. And I think that their plastic is very welcome at that point. It's something that is, as I said, man-made. It's something that at that point, at least, was seen as almost undepleting source. But then obviously as the century wore on and as the 20th century came in, and plastics became much more prevalent in our lives, both in terms of the objects that it was used for. I mean, everything from packaging to things like Tupperware or mugs, cups, nylons. It also we created a system and a society that's much more dependent on plastics as a material. And I think that this very moment, 2020, with the pandemic, one can see a kind of return to the heroization of plastics because it's something that's been life-saving for many people. We have still, nevertheless, over the last 50 years, understood that plastics is maybe a little bit too prevalent in our society. And I think that that's something that the V&A collection also really represents in terms of the number of pieces made from plastics existing in the collection from the late 20th century. And again, the collection does represent that moment of us questioning it. We, for example, acquired the Thomas Thwaites toaster project that he did when he graduated from Royal College of Art, where he investigated if he could make a toaster like the one he found in a supermarket himself. And again, the search for him in finding a way of making plastic became extremely prevalent, and also made him understand, and the project really represents how something we take so for granted in our day-to-day life is in fact an extremely exhausting process to reach. So what we think is so simple and that we maybe don't consider or haven't considered is something that we should all kind of focus much more on, and that's what his project says. So I think that as a collection and as a kind of from a point of view of the V&A collection, I think we're interested in exploring that trajectory of plastic in people's minds. But of course, we're also interested in understanding what this very moment, which I can see as a problem and an identity crisis for the material, can do for how we produce, how we use plastic going forward. And I think that's where it's really exciting that we're working together on it. And I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, Matteo.
No, it's interesting that you call it an identity crisis of plastics. The question is, will it still be around in 10 or 20 years? I think it's hard to imagine that we completely get rid of that material because it's so ubiquitous that it will be hard to replace it in any use. So I suppose you agree that it's rather about how can we replace it with more sustainable alternatives, which will probably also be or have to be called plastics, but in a different way. It's probably not the same chemical components, but and also different life cycles and footprints when being produced. So do you agree that we'll not be able to replace it completely, but it's rather about creating different plastics?
I mean, this is the very fantastic function of the word plastics, that within it there are so many different types, you know, as indeed your Atlas of Furniture Design actually speaks about. There are already plastics that are made from natural materials, and they've existed since the last 150 years. But we are going back to looking at a much more natural way of making plastic that isn't as exhaustive for our natural resources as they have been to date. And I think, no, of course, plastics will continue. And I think it's an absolutely vital aspect of healthcare, for example. And I think that plastics are not going to be possible to completely remove from our society, but I definitely think that there's a lot of interesting research happening right now in what the new types of plastics are. But I also think a more important aspect of that is how we reuse it and how we recycle it and the systems for looking after it. And I think that that's something that's also making a lot of headway at the moment, in terms of a more circular thinking around how plastics is consumed. But I think as consumers, as someone who visits supermarkets and stores, and as we all do, or I would say most of us do, we have to also consider our own implication in that, in terms of how we can cut back, but also demand differently and more. And I think there's some really great examples of supermarkets actually taking on board what consumers want in that sense, removing plastic packaging, creating biodegradable bags, or indeed just doing package-free aisles altogether. I mean, we're packaging obsessed a society, I'd say.
And there's also a lot of greenwashing, right? So using the argument of sustainability to increase sales. So I think in an exhibition about plastics, it will be a challenge for us as museums to really judge what is a serious progress and seriously sustainable, and where is the argument of being either biodegradable or being sourced from ocean plastics. Where is it just a marketing claim, but not really improving the ecological footprint? So, I mean, this is something I see as a real challenge as a museum, to judge the real contributions to solve a problem from the ones that just pretend to solve it, but at the end, it's part of the problem, not the solution.
But then if you look at that in the kind of bigger context of museum practice, I think it is also our role to capture that moment. And I think that that's what one can do through collection activity, because I think that it's even capturing the fact that there is something such as greenwashing, or capturing the fact that there are so many examples of new types of plastics, and being able to say, how they're different and what they are trying to contribute to society is again something that is actually of value also to the future. Because if we just lose all of that, not research, but if you lose the kind of materiality of those things, it's something that will be a problem for the future. So I think that being able to look at this particular moment sometime, years ahead, is also valuable in terms of saying that this happened, this took place. There was a real drive, both from industry designers, whether that was for genuine care for the planet, or if it was for a more ulterior motive in terms of, as you say, greenwash. Time will tell, but it is also our role to capture that perspective.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We had an interesting discussion about especially this aspect when discussing the ore stream project by Forma Fantasma, where they created furniture from pieces that are seemingly taken from computer waste or electronic waste. And obviously this is not the future solution for making furniture, but it's, as you say, capturing a moment, and it's capturing a debate, and it's more a kind of, it's not meant negatively, a conversation piece than a real problem solver. But I think this is a new function that design has also gained, right? It's not, and it's especially not about the functionality of sitting on that chair, but it's about representing an attitude in design, and that attitude can have an influence on behavior and on other designers, right?
For sure, and I think that Ore Streams, so just to sort of explain, so Ore Streams is a project that was first shown, I believe, in Melbourne in Australia for the Triennale there 3 years ago or 2 years ago, and it was a piece that really for me was interesting, was not necessarily the final outcome of the furniture produced by electronic waste, as you said, but it was actually the research that went into understanding what happens with our electronic waste. So a very big part of that project was an interview process with speaking to different people involved in this industry and in this field to really understand in detail what happens. What happens when you put your mobile phone into an envelope and send it somewhere, and you're told that it's being recycled. At that point, what happens to it? What happens when you take your computer to the recycling station? And I think that exhibition or research project was a real eye-opener for, I think, people who didn't know of those processes. And again, it was extremely important in terms of flagging an issue, that we have a semi-understanding of being an issue and saying this is why it's an issue, and this is why you should pay more attention, and this is why you as a consumer should ask more questions. So I think that it had an important effect for the people who saw it. I think that maybe the project didn't reach enough people, but if you can look it up online, I think some of the films are still existing there.
Well, the price was quite prohibitive. So, I mean, at the end, this is to be sold in galleries, and I think maybe this is a role that we as museums have, right? To share the attitude that is condensed in these kind of works and projects, research projects, with a larger audience. So the object is a kind of catalyst, just like a museum, to foster a debate which has to take place. And the designer is making a contribution for that debate to happen. And for me, that's also quite emblematic for what has changed in the design and the museum world, that it's no longer enough to put an object on a pedestal and say, this is it, look at it, how beautiful it is. But the work has become much more challenging, right? Do you share that impression that, curating design exhibitions 20 years ago was a different thing? Now it's really about contexts, about explaining, about also having very sharp arguments. I think the sharpness of the debate has become really very strong, which I adore. I think it's great. because it's finally also bringing more critique and more controversy in the design world, which is needed. What's your experience with that at the V&A? I mean, you made a few exhibitions at the V&A which were controversial and addressing really political issues, right?
Yes, I mean, I would say, because I wasn't the curator of those shows, and I don't necessarily want to kind of comment on the kind of overall approach of the V&A there, but I can definitely say that as a function or as a role of the museum, I think what's become very important in the last few years, and which I think is greatly welcome, is really connecting to something I said earlier in terms of how we need to think and act beyond the usual suspects. I think that many museums have come to look at its audiences in a very different way in the last decade. I think that we have come to understand that how we reach people and who we reach has to be different to how it has been before. And again, we're speaking about very different contexts, you know, in terms of being a big national museum within a large city, and Vitra Design Museum, which has a very different funding model and is in a very different location. But I think that, you know, as a public institution, the museum needs to engage its visitors and needs to listen to what its visitors want to learn about. And I think that we find so often in speaking to our visitors that what they like to engage with, and what, for example, our young school visitors are really engaged with, is a kind of obsession around environment, about what goes on in our world in terms of how can we be sustainable, how can we support that. It's something that I think has been at the forefront of very many young people's minds in recent years, and I think that the museum needs to mirror society in that sense in terms of reflecting interests. And I think that that goes across the board in many different fields and areas of interest. I think that museums need to be you know, be a public convenience for that public debate to happen. And I think that's very important. I think that's what you see in many different institutions at the moment, is that people are responding to that. And I think as a result, yes, a more engaged debate and a more open debate around some of the topics and issues that you and I have spoken about today is welcome, and I think many audiences do welcome it.
Yeah, I feel the same. So makes curating and working in museums even more interesting. This is what I feel. So it's a really special, especially challenging time, which is always good. So Johanna, thank you very much. I think that was a wonderful insight in a few topics from our museum practice. And personally, I'm really looking forward to that collaboration on the topic of plastics.
Of course, so am I.
So I hope our audience will follow the outcome of that in early 2022. It will be. I also wanted to, just for those who have tuned in later, you know, mention the Atlas again. It's really a book which is the tip of the iceberg, as you rightly said, Johanna, but even the tip of the iceberg is interesting. Even the tip of the iceberg is about 1,700 objects, which we tried to document and to make a contribution to understand the world of furniture and in interiors that we all live in, and that we especially lived in, are still living in this year, 2020. Johanna, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for taking on the mammoth task of making the Atlas of Furniture Design.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.